Hi, I'm Carter Wilson, best-selling author and writing coach, and welcome to today's Motivation for Writers. So I want to talk today about writer's block. And I know right away some people are going to hear that phrase and think I'm going to say that writer's block isn't real and all you need to do is sit down and write. And that's not quite what I believe, because I absolutely think writer's block is real, or at least there is a block there, a block that could happen to you whether you're a writer or not. And I just don't think it usually means what people think it means. Because when most writers say they have writer's block, what they're really saying is, I can't move forward. And those are not the same thing. Because a block doesn't automatically mean that you've run out of ideas or your imagination has run dry. It doesn't mean that you've suddenly lost creativity. And it certainly doesn't mean you're broken. Usually it means something is standing between you and the creativity. And that's an important distinction, because if you just consider yourself as someone who's run out of ideas, you're not giving your imagination any credit. And you're not looking to the real cause of why you're suddenly unable to tap in to that creativity that you've relied on for so long. And because if you think the problem is that your imagination disappeared, you panic. Maybe you start thinking you never had talent to begin with, or the magic is gone. Or maybe the book you're working on is a mistake. But I think the issue isn't absence. I think the issue is resistance. I've become more and more interested over the years in the teachings of Carl Jung, and not in a mystical way. More in the sense that Carl Jung believed the parts of ourselves that we repress or avoid don't disappear. They find ways to emerge eventually through behavior, through anxiety, through avoidance, through distraction. All these things come back, and it's interesting in the 250 plus interviews I've had on my podcast, Making It Up, talking to writers about how they started writing. Some people don't start till the age of 70. And the common thread I see through all of these writers is they were always a writer. And if they tried to repress it and get a different type of job, the writer always finds a way to come out at the end. And I think that aligns with what Carl Jung would teach. Writing will expose the stuff that you're trying to repress, because writing is not just typing words. It forces confrontation with yourself, with fear, with ambition, with vulnerability or honesty. A lot of times you're tapping into some of your darkest memories through your writing. Sometimes the truths you didn't even realize were inside you until you started putting a story together come out. And I think a lot of what we call writer's block is, friction between who we are now and who the work is trying to force us to become. Yeah, okay, maybe that sounds a little bit dramatic, but I think it's true. Because the act of finishing a book changes things. Being seen changes things. Getting better changes things. And not only does success change things, even failure changes things. And there's part of our psyche that often wants stability more than transformation. That we would rather stay with what we know, even if what we know isn't making us happy, than to venture into territories that we've never explored before. So consciously, you may desperately want to finish the book. Unconsciously, maybe there's part of you that's terrified of what finishing actually means. So let's talk about some of the actual things that creates blocks. I mean, I know I have been there. I have had moments that stretch into days of not knowing what to do next. And early on, I think one of the biggest fears I had was just being a bad writer. This will lessen the longer you write, the more that you learn, especially once you've had some success or some recognition or even just enough experience to know what good writing looks like. But early on, you're just excited to create something, and later you become aware of the gap between what you want the book to be and what's actually showing up on the page in front of you. And that awareness can freeze you out. Not because you've run out of ideas, but because you're afraid the writing won't live up to the vision that was in your head. So instead of writing badly and moving forward, you stop moving altogether. And that is not at all lack of imagination. That's fear. Another block is perfectionism disguised as standards. You might call this being careful. I think it's called being scared. And what it looks like is you just keep outlining, or you keep revising chapter 1, or you keep researching, or you spend way too much time on a single sentence trying to get it just right. And sure, all of it feels productive because technically you are working. But I think what's really happening is you're refusing to move forward until you can guarantee the result. I see this a lot with my writing students who will spend years writing and rewriting a manuscript because in a way they don't want to be done with it. Trying to be perfect is not the solution. Especially novels. Novels are messy. Discovery is messy. You usually do not think your way clearly to the end. You feel your way there. You go off of instincts. And what that means is confusion naturally becomes part of the process. But perfectionists are going to treat that confusion like danger. So they stop. Another block that you probably don't hear about too much, but it's absolutely real, is the fear of wasting time. And I think this is true, especially if you're starting to write as an older person. Because when you're younger, spending a year on a novel feels adventurous. Later, it can feel expensive. Because you start thinking, what if nobody wants this? What if this goes nowhere? What if I spend all this time and emotional energy and it changes nothing? That can absolutely create paralysis. Especially after rejection, especially after disappointment. And this is particularly true if you have people around you who treat your writing like a hobby instead of something meaningful. Because if you're not treating your own writing like you would your career, regardless of whether you're published or not, then you're in danger of this particular block. You're going to think you're wasting time because you're just viewing it as a hobby. And it becomes very hard to protect creative work that part of you secretly feels embarrassed to defend. And then there's this block, the loss of trust in your own instincts. This is a big one. You start overthinking everything. Every scene becomes a debate. Every chapter becomes a referendum on your talent. Every wrong turn feels claustrophobic. You stop listening to the story and you start trying to engineer some kind of certainty. And I am telling you, certainty is death for creativity. And look, I'm not saying structure doesn't matter. It absolutely does. But at some point, you have to trust yourself enough to keep moving even when you cannot fully see the path yet. My books are not written at all with any kind of clarity. I don't outline, and I'm not saying that's the best way to do it. You have to go by how your own brain works. But I trust myself enough to know that my first draft will have some kind of story that can be salvaged, even if it's a mess. And the important thing is to get that first draft just done. And here's something that I've been thinking about lately when I think about blocks, is that sometimes the block isn't the enemy. Just as I think rejection's not the enemy. Rejection is a sign. Rejection is redirection. Rejection is getting you to pay more attention to something so you can learn and grow. And with blocks, sometimes the block is signaling that something important is happening underneath the surface. And this isn't always, so I want to be careful how I talk about this, because absolutely sometimes the block is burnout, sometimes it's exhaustion, sometimes you just need sleep or therapy or a break from trying to do too much. But sometimes there's that friction and resistance that shows up because you're getting close to something honest. And this is, I think, when your writing becomes almost therapeutic, because maybe you're getting close to a scene that scares you, close to a truth that you keep trying to downplay, or to vulnerability, or you're getting close to saying the thing you actually mean instead of the thing that sounds polished. So Jung talked a lot about the shadow, the parts of ourselves that we repress or avoid because it makes us uncomfortable. We spend our lives running from our shadow, but the shadow doesn't go away. And writing has a way of dragging that dark material into the light. And I think sometimes the reason writers suddenly stall is because the story is heading towards something very emotionally real, and part of them wants to pull away. That doesn't mean you should stop. I think it means you should pay attention. Again, if you were seeing a therapist and they asked you some very hard questions and you had to speak out loud a truth that you hadn't told anyone, it's scary. And I think even if you're writing fiction, when you dig into those places in your own past, in your own memories, and you are saying things on the page that you've never admitted to anyone, even in the cloak of a fictitious character, it's very vulnerable. So when you're dealing with a block, I think a mistake a writer can make is immediately asking, how do I force myself through this? I think the better question, if this happens to you, is what is this block trying to show me? What am I actually afraid of here? Am I afraid the book will fail? Or am I afraid it might succeed and force me to become more visible? Am I avoiding this chapter because it's weak? Or because maybe it's a little bit too honest? Am I blocked because the story is dead? Or because I'm trying to control it a little bit too tightly? I know these are uncomfortable questions, but you have to ask yourself them because uncomfortable questions tend to lead somewhere useful. And I think this is important too. Not every project is meant to survive. Which is a horrifying thing, isn't it? All that time and all that effort you put into something. But sometimes the block really is telling you something about the work itself. Sometimes the concept is not alive enough. Sometimes the voice is false. Sometimes you're writing to the market instead of to something emotionally real. That all happens. But the problem is if you assume that too early, if you feel a small amount of resistance and immediately conclude, well, I guess the book isn't working. Not necessarily, because sometimes you're just simply in the difficult part. Sometimes your subconscious is fighting transformation. Growth feels threatening before it feels exciting. That's totally normal. There's a quote that's often attributed to Jung that says, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." And boy, is that true with writing. Because usually the thing we avoid in our work is the thing carrying the most energy. The scene that maybe we're postponing because it's a little bit too real, or the emotional truth that we keep circling, or the risk that we keep trying to downplay. And that might be the doorway, not around the block, but right through it. So if you're blocked right now, I don't think the answer is shaming yourself. And I also don't think the answer is romanticizing the struggle and waiting for inspiration to descend from the heavens. It might sound fun to tell people you have writer's block, but that's romanticizing it. I think the answer is curiosity. What is actually standing in my way here? Could be fear, exhaustion, perfectionism, shame, external pressure, maybe a fear of visibility, a fear of failing publicly. Think through all of those things, because once you identify the real obstacle, the block starts becoming something you can navigate. That doesn't mean it's easy to do so, but at least you understand it. And understanding changes everything. Writer's block is real, but I don't think it usually means you've lost creativity. I think more often it means something inside you needs attention before creativity can move freely again. And sometimes the breakthrough is closer than you think. not because struggle automatically guarantees transformation, but because resistance often appears when something meaningful is trying to emerge. So don't just ask, how do I eliminate the block? Ask, what is this really trying to show me? I think you'll find out that that question alone changes everything. Now go write.